even as a kid, I was like, I don't like that. Blaming the generation before you again, and then claiming that you had the arrogance and smarts to fix it.
Oh, okay. I'm going to bring up something here.
Selfishness. That I'm tying this back to the, you're saying that the boomers were selfish. Absolutely. But more, it was rooted in their arrogance. They actually thought they could fix the human mind and turn it from a sinful mess into a lollipops and butterflies. They believed that.
And this is why they started focusing on the schools so much, right?
Yeah, but they had figured out that they were going to get older and they needed jobs. And so if they were going to, and you can go back and find some of this in their writing, it doesn't show up that much. It was sort of a collective verbal discussion that said, we're all going to stay in school and get, 3 doctorates, but then we're going to own the schools. We're going to become the profs, and we're going to teach this philosophy that we believe is going to fix the human mind. They're the ones that started all the sociology and psychology. Those were minor departments in universities until they took over, and they exploded them because they thought that was the way to fix the human mind.
Studying liberal arts and a liberal arts education before what Fred's mentioned here, the explosion of sociology and psychology. Liberal arts was a good education. It was well-rounded. They taught you philosophy. You learned a lot about history. It made you into a well-rounded, well-informed person who knew a lot about the world, and then you could go in and apply it. No, they didn't teach you application for your education. They just kind of tried to impart some wisdom. Well, it became specific or career specific in this time when the soft sciences took on a greater greater role. I don't know what the right word for that is.
Yeah, I don't know what the right word is either, because again, my experience was it's always been this way. If you have this highly fractalized college experience where if you're going to be an engineer, you're going to spend all your time in this part of campus. Like even on my little campus where I was going, there are entire buildings that I don't even know what the inside looked like. But I knew where all the offices were and where all the computer labs were in both of the computer science buildings. Like by the end of it, I'd read the room number and off I'd go, right? But I spent most of my time in about 3 buildings out of 10 on campus.
Well, I spent my time at the University of Washington dreading having to go up to upper campus because it was literally split. It was geographically split. All the sciences are down in the south end, and to do distribution requirements, I had to drag myself up the hill to the north end. And all those classes I took up there, I was like, I'm just surviving. I don't want to be anywhere near. And that's the mid '80s.
So what you're saying is they took over
the same
quick.
Thing. University of Minnesota, same thing. You had the West Bank and the East Bank, okay, because they were across the river from each other.
That's even more.
You'd go to the West Bank for all the business, and I don't know, you had a few classes over there, but engineering, that's one of the old classic training. So you were on the East Bank. That was the tradition. That was the original site. So there was divisions that way. And yeah, there were a lot of buildings that I never went into.
All right. So we're kind of what? Go ahead.
No, that's kind of how it was when I went to Texas Tech. So there's probably 3 or 4 buildings. I remember I had the path. It just kind of like a diagonal line that connected all the buildings. It was always in this one path. And they had all this whole other side of campus that I never even went to. So, well, except to pick up the girlfriend at the time. She was over there. So,
well, now you wouldn't because she'd be screeching. But okay, so we're kind of moving up into the 80s here, and now to be fair, we don't really have an Xer in the building in the chat. But Xers actually had a pretty significant impact on culture too, and I would call it. So if we go back to the generational cycle that we talked about, if the prophets are they're the awakening, and as my dad said, they started destroying everything. And so the Xers are kind of living in this world where things still function, but they don't function properly. And they know it. But I don't know, is it like they feel like they can't do anything about it because or do they feel like, or is their nihilism sort of more because Dad, you were talking earlier about, the boomers are trying to do all these great things, but they were selfish about it for themselves. The Xers have the same selfishness, but they have none of the idealism about it.
Everybody, you can always, there's always an element and a track of rebellion against your elders. So you take the hyper idealistic prophets who are very controlling. They've got a plan and they're going to control the class syllabus, and you're really allowed to dissent. That's where I found myself as a looking up at them going, dissent here is not allowed. And they did that to their fathers, and they did that to the people who followed them. So you get this rebellion, but you also get a nihilism that comes from, well, you guys said you were going to perfect the human mind, but you didn't do it. That was the generation they were going to fix. So you have that resentment and this obviously unwillingness to be heard by that your parents. And they handed you a key to the house, the latch key, but they're out fixing somebody else's kids, but you've been ditched. Is that a good enough description of it?
Yeah, it is, and that was an interesting observation that this generation was so that the boomers were so focused on fixing everyone that they kind of, as he described in the final slide there, they kind of ignored their own kids.
Boomers kind of had life easy because up through the 60s and 70s, the economy was doing pretty well. Yeah, we had our ups and downs, but the US was the powerhouse. We had the big corporations, we had all the knowledge. You could get a job. I graduated in 85. It was kind of tough to find a job in engineering. I was lucky enough that I got one. But remember the stock market hit its low in what was it, 82, something like that. And then we had this surge. That's kind of when Microsoft started around that time. And I remember when Intel and the chips were coming out and this new thing, and this is going to be great. The US is going to have design these chips, and we're going to build the chips here. Intel is going to be phenomenal. And nope. It was started in the 80s, and progressively they outsourced all our manufacturing. And I did that show on the shoes.
Mm-hmm.
The US shoemakers, they were going down in the 80s because they started to export it. And by the early 90s, most of our shoemaking industry was now overseas. And okay, that I'm just using that as an example of all the jobs, all the expertise, all these old-fashioned industries that started leaving. So it was tough being a late boomer or early Xer in the 80s, figuring out, okay, they just pulled the rug out from under us. But of course, you didn't see it at that time.
Well, so okay, so as a little bit of a side note, Intel is required by national security law to keep some fabs in the United States, and they do, and they're actually really mad right now because the federal government's reneging on a payment. But for a fab they just built. But in general, Steve is absolutely right, and that is interesting because so there was the stock market crash of October '87, but we actually recovered really quickly from that. And
But that was 87. It hit its
Yes.
low in 83. And there was a boom from 82 to
Yep.
87. We
Well,
thought we were flying.
the
I
early
remember
80s,
the oil market crashed in '88.
yeah. But the
That's the
early
year I was
80s
born.
recession was almost deliberate. The Reagan administration inherited a really weak, relatively weak economy from the Carter administration, and they told us, "Hey, we are going to fix it, but it's got to get worse before it gets better." And it was 2 or 3 years, 81, 2, 3 of now this isn't going real great. Economic growth is slow. They raised the interest rates sky high to clear out debt, and it did. It worked. And then the Hunt brothers did their little silver finagle. I was tangentially involved in that because my dad was in the photographic business by then. So we were recovering silver out of photographic negatives and selling it at outrageous rates. It was kind of silly, but that only lasted a year. But that was a collusion thing. But yeah, the early '80s economic thing was deliberate, and it worked, and everybody knew what they were doing, which was not true in the '80s. It was just haphazard.
In retrospect, that period where from the 70s, the engineers were in charge. The industry, the production was in charge. And then we hit this transition. And when the stock market boomed up into 87, that was the beginning of the financialization.
yes, sir.
And the exporting of all the expertise and the making, being a productive. Our economy is based on production. That transition happened in the 80s. Beginning of the 80s, we're still based on production. By the end of the 80s, our wealth is based on financialization. That was a huge transition. And we kind of only in retrospect can we realize what an impact that had on our lives on our attitudes.
Well, and this is actually a huge point that I want to touch on because one of the problems that we keep talking about is, well, but there's no jobs. There's no jobs. Well, it kind of depends on what you're doing and where you are. If you're designing things like, say, chips, high-end CPUs, the kind that sit in every computer that you guys are using, are designed right here. Well, they're actually designed in Oregon. And it's the Intel has an engineering campus down in Pendleton, Oregon, I believe. And then
Corvallis,
AMD has a campus down in Silicon Valley somewhere. AMD has no fabs. They go to a company called TSMC in Taiwan, and they do all the fab work. So AMD needs a bunch of high-priced engineers and very high-priced engineers for the kind of work they're doing, but they don't need a production staff. They outsource that. Intel outsources some. In fact, I just read an article today about or yesterday morning about how the TSMC is building some Intel designs right now. So not all, but some. And what happens when we do that is all of a sudden there's entire, for lack of a better term, classes of people who can't get jobs. I mean, how many people do you know fit the bill for high-priced CPU engineer? I can't even do that. So, what's your average?
That's a 0.0 something% of the population.
Right, exactly. and the IQs required are, 130, 140 to do this. Well, that's just that doesn't, for a lot of the population, that economy doesn't work. And I think that's where you start to see because in the 90s we had a fairly stable economy, but as Steve said, that economy was based on financialization, specifically of the move overseas. So they were able to leverage the cheap debt that Greenspan allowed to happen to build overseas fabs. I mean, Apple's entire production line was built during this period. Their Chinese production line was built during this period. And at the time, Chinese labor was cheap. It's not now. It's actually twice as expensive as Mexican labor, which is wild when you think about it. That's a whole nother show that we could do. But the point is that the average person in the United States no longer goes to high school and can get a job.
Well, let's bring this down to something that people can actually relate to. In the 80s and 90s, you went to buy a washing machine. It was made in the U.S. Whirlpool, General Electric, Kenmore. Yeah. I mean, try and find a washing machine made someplace else. Now, you go to your local Home Depot. I challenge you to find a washing machine made in the U.S.
And they make it all this eco part so it breaks down and doesn't even last. Thank you, government.
Well, yeah, you could have a washing machine that lasted you 20 years. Parts didn't change much. They were all available. None of this plastic crap. It didn't break much. If it broke, you could get it fixed. Now, 10 years later, oh, we discontinued that model. We can't get parts for that. You're going to have to buy a new one. It's not based on the quality of production or the pride in the longevity of a product. It's a financial product. It's kind of a gee whiz product. Yeah, it works good, but it has planned obsolescence.
Yeah, Tacticus, you're right. You can't find 100% American made furniture either. That is good luck. I mean, you might find stuff that was assembled here. That might be the best you get.
Yeah, that story, the furniture story, devastated the Carolinas because that was the hub of furniture manufacturing, and they just wiped it out. Absolutely wiped it out in the 1980s. Offshored it all.
Oh, we lost.
And every region has a story like that.
Oh, yeah. Well, Detroit and the automotive.
Yep.
Let's see. What are the other ones we can think of? I know there was stuff down in Texas. I don't remember what it was.
The South was less affected. The South, because the South has its own culture, and it's I don't know that much of that left, but the rebel culture was still there. We do our own stuff. I could probably find you the lyrics to a song in the 70s about the oil crisis. It was like, drive 75 and freeze them alive, freeze the Yankees. It was very independent culture. I thought Steve would get a kick out of that. You probably never heard it. That was about 1978.
I haven't. No.
I mean, I grew up with rebel flags on the back of pickup trucks, and I knew where the Klansmen lived in our neighborhood in the 60s. That was all muted down by the mid 70s, but it was a 60s thing. But that culture did its own thing, and it looked at it and said, well, Dallas Fort Worth, they built aircraft, all kinds, helicopters, airplanes.
Okay, that's defense industry. They're
Yeah.
not
Well, it
going
was
to let
also the
that go.
result of having the Speaker of the House be from that area for like 2 decades. That was telling you. It didn't hurt.
Yeah. Okay, so so we're moving through the 80s and 90s, and so in the 90s, the millennials are going to school. They're still not in the culture yet. The Xers, they're just now starting to find jobs, really, is what's going on here. the bulk of the Xer generations. I mean, Steve, you're 85 and you're early Xer, late boomer. So, you found a job in 85, so that means that if you look at the length of generation, you've got about from, we'll call it 80 to 2000, where the Xers are the ones that are really kind of in charge and of the sort of day-to-day work. So, what I find interesting though is that the Xers never really they rebelled against it, but they adopted more of an attitude of, well, and this might be, now that you say it, Dad, that because the boomers were so rigid and just said, no, you can't challenge us, we're doing the right thing for the world. I wonder if that's really the source of the Xer nihilism, because they love to be able to speak back to the elder generation and say, guys, this isn't working, but they're told that they're and that they're wrong. And so they just feel like, well, there's just nothing we can do about this. So every man for himself.
They didn't have the numbers to make a dent in the boomers. All the positions and decent jobs and senior people were boomers with years to go for retirement. There was it was difficult for upward mobility or to gain a position of power or even be heard. I mean, it was kind of like, well, guess I better just plod along because there's not a damn thing I can do.
So there's.
I got tired of business consultants because they were the same way. They were all elder boomers, and they would tell you what you should do, but man, would they listen to you? Or any feedback? No feedback allowed. We're the experts.